Hi, I'm Jessie. I'm the founder of MarijuanaMommy.com and a cannabis nurse, and you are watching Patients Are the Proof, where we talk about the real health benefits of cannabis. Today, I'm talking with Brad Bogus, who is the VP of Growth and Marketing at Confident Cannabis.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Brad, how are you?
Doing great. Happy Halloween to you and
Oh,
everybody watching.
happy Halloween. I love your costume.
Thank you. I am my 15-year-old self.
I am not your 15-year-old self. That's funny.
You are definitely not my 15-year-old self.
Video games all day. Yeah. I am not in costume ever.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
I'm not a fan of Halloween, but that's okay.
It's totally all right.
So let's talk about Confident Cannabis. So you guys are working on a amazing, groundbreaking new application. It's called Connect, right?
Yep.
Cool. So tell me a little bit about Confident Cannabis and a little bit about you, and then we'll go into exactly what Connect can do for people.
Certainly. Yeah. So Confident Cannabis is a software company, and we service the cannabis industry, specifically helping cannabis operators buy, sell, and test their supply. And the thing about Connect that's so interesting is for us to do the things that we wanted to do in the cannabis space, namely bringing transparency and confidence to wholesale buying and trade, as well as testing. There was a need to create laboratory testing software for the cannabis lab side of the industry. And we built software for them as like our first platform that we built, specifically so that we could start to acquire an access of information for verified cannabis tests that weren't being self-reported. And the reason we did this was because the main problem that exists in wholesale cannabis, where cannabis businesses are buying and selling from one another, is around transparency and confidence behind what people tell you something is. Whether that's testing results or potency or, pesticides or heavy metals. Like, you want to know whenever someone tells you this cannabis is X, Y, or Z, that there's something there to verify that it actually is that thing, especially given that every regulated market requires testing before you sell something. So we built lab software, and we have, over the course of the 3 years, acquired over 40% of the labs nationwide. And what that means is that they're all using our software and sending the lab testing data of all of the cannabis supply that comes through their doors to their clients through that software. And we, therefore, also get access to that data. So in the pursuit of building a better wholesale market for cannabis, we built lab software to acquire the data on testing information. And as a result of that, we ended up having this like amazing bevy of data on cannabis testing information that just is larger. It's a larger data set and a more complete data set than anybody has. And it's just by virtue of us working with all of these labs nationwide. So because we have all this data, one of the things that excited me the most when I first joined the company was the implications behind it, right? If you're able to look at all of the cannabis flower on the market, and I'm a total flower nerd, just to take a step back, I've been consuming cannabis now for almost 15 years. Even though I started doing that in Texas, where everything is extremely
you're brave.
Yeah, exactly. And you are risking a bit, although, I'm not the demographic they're typically looking for. But, still in Texas, at any given time, if you have even a gram on you and you're driving, you could go to jail for 6 months. That is a possibility, at least. So, it's hard to consume cannabis safely or confidently there. You have to find the right people. And luckily, I eventually did find some of the right people who were able to educate me on incredible amounts of information that was just not available to most people in Texas. The person I connected with, coincidentally, happened to also be connected with some of the greatest doctors and researchers in the cannabis space, Sue Sicily, Ethan Russo. So the information I was getting and I was just cramming into my brain about cannabis was immense. And then I moved to the regulated cannabis market of Colorado and was able to start, buying varieties of which I knew things were what they said they were to a large extent, depending on, who you bought from. So I was able to buy from retailers and cultivators that I knew and trusted, that I had actually been able to tour their grow and know how they grew, and then was able to test things individually between my wife and I on like what strains make us feel good, which don't make us feel good. This is a bit of a tangent, but the point I'm making here is that all we were ever trying to do was find out this one very simple question, the answer to it, which is which cannabis will make me feel the way I want to feel. It's a very simple question.
It's a very simple question, and the same question that every patient out there has. And it's something, you know, I go into a lot and with patients, and it's so frustrating how many people and how many even medical professionals still think that all cannabis is the same. And it's not. It's so different. And I tell people all the time, like, one strain can cause a very different physiological reaction than another strain. And it's all about trial and error. And I try to encourage patients to consider it a lot like pharmaceuticals, where you try several different ones before you find one that works. But this, like when you showed me Connect, I was amazed because, like you said, it could really potentially help patients find a strain that would really help them without trying a million different ones in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what excited me so much whenever I first joined and saw the data set, was that there's implications here that can be far more accurate than just like the, you know, sort of guesswork that comes into trying to answer this question. The other part of that question that's important to answer is, what cannabis should I avoid? Because some stuff really doesn't give us the right reaction and makes us feel paranoid or stressed out or anxious. And so what Connect is a software platform where we took all of the data for cannabis flower nationwide that has been tested for both cannabinoids and terpenes, due to the, you know, sort of current prevailing theory that the combination of both of those types of compounds is ultimately what's going to determine effect, not genetics necessarily, not indica sativa hybrid by any means, but rather the full compound of the flowers. And so we took all of the data that existed for just cannabinoids and terpenes alone, and we analyzed all 26 of those different compounds against each strain in the database.
How many strains do you have in the database currently?
Well, in our actual full database, we have testing samples of, you know, over 250,000 different cannabis products. But the flowers that we're showing in Connect, there are 3,000. And we specifically are only showing flower strains that are being produced nationwide by more than, I think, 8 producers in 3 regions. Could be 3 producers in 8 regions. I don't think the math works there. But basically the point is, we didn't want to include proprietary strains or strains that were only being grown regionally by 1 or 2 producers. And the reason why was because we're trying to protect some of this data privacy. We don't necessarily want to be just showing the world someone's chemical testing data, easily able to determine who grew that, right? But for the most part, what we're showing you are most of the strains in the market that are being grown that aren't proprietary. And we're showing you their similarities and differences in a 3D space. So when you're talking about all of this information, this is a lot of math that we're having to do here, but essentially the only way to really visualize that meaningfully in a way that can give all of the information we want to give across to a patient or a consumer without them having to understand data science is to put it into a 3D space with a whole bunch of dots. And those dots are either densely clustered because they're chemically similar, or they're distant from one another because they're chemically dissimilar. And that's ultimately what we're trying to present here, is like, here are a number of different chemical profiles. Some of them are the same strains in totally different places within Connect, which show you that the same strain produces different results, oftentimes based on cultivation decisions or climate.
I think that's important. A lot of people don't understand that. They think, you know, oh, it's the same strain. I've had it, you know, in New Jersey. It must be the same everywhere, and it's not, right? Strains can
and I'll be able to show you that here on Connect today, is that you can look at same strain genetics but see wildly different results, or sometimes some expected results. You know. It all just depends on the producer. It depends on different factors. Sometimes genetics do predict some things, and it's not correct to say that genetics are in no way predictive of effect, or at least predictive of chemical profile. But for the most part, the same genetics will produce different things. And you see this actually in competitions like the Grow Off, where nationwide they're throwing different competitions, different regions, and giving people the exact same strain genetics as certified by Phylos Bioscience.
Amazing.
So they have all of these different competitors, sometimes 30 to 100 different competitors growing in different ways, and what they get are different results. So, you know, there's all of these experiments sort of happening in the cannabis industry that are proving this out. We happen to have the data set that can complement that and say, here's the current most complete data set on cannabis chemistry that exists. For the consumer and for the patient, this is now a tool to use to determine what strains make you feel good and what you think, based on where you've had those strains regionally, which chemical profile matches the experience you've had. And then using that chemical profile, you can start to find new strains that you can go try that will either have the exact same effect or will match the chemical profiles of strains you don't want to experience because they've given you a negative effect.
That's so amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up and you'll walk me through it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So let's see. So it's connect.confidentcannabis.com, right?
Yep. Or you could just go to confidentcannabis.com and click on the link in the header.
Cool.
But it will take you here.
I am well over 21.
You don't look it, Jesse.
Thank you.
So when you first log into this, there's going to be a little tutorial that kind of walks you through this. For anyone who's coming to this for the first time, I highly suggest you go through not just this information, but also all of the little question marks that are shown throughout. I'll make sure that we point those out as we go along. But those little question marks will give you information about how to understand what you're seeing, because this isn't the simplest tool on the planet, right? What we're showing is extremely complicated data in a 3D space, and we're trying to compartmentalize information that we present to you based on that. So this will help you understand why there are different types of dots. So the first thing I want to point out is that every dot here represents a strain of flower, and there are two types of dots. One is called a composite dot. The composite dot is sort of what you expect nationally for any given strain. So if we're talking about Jack Herrera, for instance, the composite dot will show you what you should expect from Jack Herrera nationwide. But then there are individual dots called private dots that show you how individual producers in different regions are creating different chemical expressions of Jack Herrera. Wow. So you have composite dots and you have private dots. The important thing to really evaluate here is where the private dots show up in comparison to that composite. In other words, you get to see the differences that exist in these different private cultivations and how far they actually vary from the actual national expected strain composition, right? So, so that's one thing to understand. The other is the color of the dots. The color determines the dominant cannabinoid present in that strain. So almost all cannabis is grown to be THC dominant. That's why you mostly see the little green dots everywhere. But if you rotate the cluster a bit, you'll notice this little section over here with a bunch of purple and blue dots. The purple and blue dots are our CBD region, and it's it is showing you the dominant cannabinoid based on color here. So if it's pure CBD, it's the pink dot. If it's a balanced strain where it's like equal proportions of THC to CBD, you get these blue dots, and then varying shades in between. So some of the green dots kind of hover a little closer to blue teal. That's because they have a little bit of extra CBD in the mix. If they are sort of purple pink, that means they're a little bit higher on the CBD matrix than balanced, right? So that's what the colors mean. And then the last color is the yellow. The yellow is sort of the THCV additional cannabinoid class, because there are additional cannabinoids that are starting to show up in testing results. Like we're starting to see CBG dominant strains, for instance, although it's extremely rare. So what isn't rare are THCV dominant strains, where you see, or at least just a high concentration of THCV, more so than in anywhere else. So those determine a specific type of distinct cannabinoid class, so we color them yellow.
Very cool.
So to kind of make sense of all this, when you click on any given dot, it's going to bring up a card, and the card's going to show you information on that dot. So you just brought up Blue Dream. Blue Dream is like
Like
the nation's most popular strain, and unfortunately has something like 240 different genetic variants. So you'll notice a whole bunch of tiny little dots and lines being drawn to connect to this Blue Dream. But since you went ahead and clicked on it, go ahead and click expand. Now what we're looking at is what we call our imprint. And the imprint is in the middle of the card. So the card tells you a little bit about the strain name. Indica sativa hybrid are listed here if the producer lists that within their system. It is not listed here to say that this means anything. In fact, if anything, we show indica sativa hybrid on these cards to show you how multiple different dots within the same region can be all of the above. It's in a way to help dispel the myth that indica sativa hybrid are really predictive. And then you see it says Nevada private, which means that this was produced by a private grower in Nevada. So this is a Nevada version of Blue Dream. The imprint is in the middle, and the imprint is a distribution of the different chemical compounds that we are showing within the strain itself. So we've got cannabinoids and terpenes. We're showing you the most popular ones here just to simplify it. So on the right side where you just outlined, those are the cannabinoids. And then on the left side, those are all the terpenes. We're showing 8 and 6 respectively. So what you're going to see here are different color distributions along each of these different lines. And the side of the line it falls on tells you which of those compounds are present. For instance, we see Delta-9 THC and a little green color kind of shooting out from the middle there. That's showing us that there is that Delta-9 THC is the dominant cannabinoid here. There are no other cannabinoids really showing up with any significant amount of data there. In fact, go ahead and click on that imprint because it'll bring up a bigger version of it and we can see it a little bit clearer. So what we're seeing is there's a sort of a middle amount of THC. The distance from the middle of this wheel to the end of this wheel tells you the potency amount based on the total amount of potency range that we see within testing results. So for THC and CBD, for instance, like the most amount of THC we'll ever see in testing is like around 35%, I think, probably. Least amount is going to be 0, obviously. So what you're seeing here on this particular imprint is like a middle amount, you know, maybe an 18% THC. And it sticks out pretty far, which tells you you're going to get a high likelihood of this strain producing this amount of THC. If that color distribution is super wide, like the gray one is behind it, that tells you there's a lot of different options for potency that can happen here. But the furthest one that's sticking out, that's the one that's going to give you like the most likely outcome. This is a little bit over-informing. For the most part, you can just look at this and get a sense of it based on color as to what the proportions of everything are, right? I'm looking at this and I can tell you, for instance, just by looking at the colors alone, myrcene is the most dominant terpene, right? There's so much more of it sticking out from the middle than any other terpene. And yet the likelihood of the myrcene is really more in the lower range because that's where it sticks out the furthest. But the point being, I can tell there's more myrcene than limonene, and there's more myrcene than pinene, both pinenes, and more than CBG, but CBG is a little bit on a different scale. There's a touch of CBG in there. So this has given me a sense of what the chemical compounds of this particular strain of Blue Dream in Nevada is. And there's not a whole lot of chemical diversity, as you can see here. Most of this is blank, right? So let's click out of this and go ahead and X out this card for Blue Dream. What I want you to do is in the search bar up left, I want you to type in Jack Herrera. I like using this one. Yeah, H-E-R-E-R. So I like this strain because it is a very popular strain. The genetics on it are relatively tight. And as you can see here, most of the chemical expressions of this tend to live densely clustered in this one little area, although there tend to be what look like 4 very wildly different versions of Jack Herrera being grown on the market.
So this is amazing. So these all have similar chemical makeups right here. And then essentially if you go out here, they're very different in terms of terpenes or cannabinoid profile, right?
Correct. Yeah. So whenever you do a search for a given strain, what you'll notice is that all these lines draw to this one nexus point. That nexus point is the composite dot. If you click on that, actually double click on it so we can zoom into that one spot specifically. Okay. So that's the composite dot of Jack Herrera. Go ahead and click expand. This is showing you again what you should expect nationally out of Jack Herer based on all of the available information that we see. And what we're seeing in this imprint is that THC is definitely in the high ranges. You know, we can expect somewhere between 22 to even 35% THC in a Jack Herer. Terpinolene is all over the board, but for the most part, high amounts of terpinolene. The largest bulge meets, you know, a little bit like, you know, between the middle and high points of this line. So lots of terpinolene that are available. CBG seems to be in high amounts as well. And then sort of proportional but low amounts of the other terpenes. It seems that also a little bit of THCV dots up here and there a little bit, but not really that much. So this is what we can expect out of Jack Herer. Just taking a look at this, I would expect Jack Herer to express THC, terpinolene, and CBG at a base minimum, right? Because that's what we see the biggest amounts of. You see the most color there. Okay, so in the cluster, let's zoom out a little bit. Keeping this dot open, right? Here are some of the other dots that lie around it. And these dots, if you click on any given one of them, should have a chemical profile pretty close to what we see here in the composite, right? So click on that one. Let's click on another one nearby. Let's get out of Nevada. Let's try to show a different region. The reason why we have a lot of Nevada data, by the way, is because Nevada requires in their regulations, wow, it's mostly Nevada. Yeah. Nevada requires in their regulations cannabinoid and terpene testing to be done. Yeah, Montana is a little oddball, right?
So Nevada requires...
They require that you do both cannabinoid and terpene testing as a base minimum. So there is more terpene data that exists in Nevada per sample than any other state, although there are states that have far more cannabis production and might have more total results due to the amount of just elective terpene testing that people will do. But what we find in our data set outside of Nevada is that generally only about 10% of cannabis flower is tested for both cannabinoid and terpenes.
Wow, that's amazing.
Mostly because it's elective and therefore it's an additional cost.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, but some companies are realizing that the more that they have terpene testing done, the higher price per pound they're likely to get on the wholesale market because they can illustrate the craft level of their production.
Wow.
So anyway, so here you can see, you know, relatively similar imprints, just visually looking at them. You know, we're seeing that CBG is definitely consistent as we would expect. THC is definitely consistent as we would expect. In fact, this one Nevada producer is producing like consistently 32 to 35% THC,
high,
which is really high and very consistent. Terpinolene shows up, although I wouldn't necessarily say as much as I probably would have expected based on the composite. That must mean that there are some other strains out here that we haven't clicked on that are higher in terpinolene. And in fact, looking at the cluster, I see these three lines drawing downwards. I bet you if you rotate that upwards and click on the dots that those connect to, I bet you those are more high in terpinolene. Let's click on that Oregon producer. Bam, look at that. Wow. Terpinolene way high. The reason I know this is, I'll dig into in a second, but essentially these are all living in the terpinolene arm. We don't really necessarily have an official name for this part of the cluster, but what we found is terpinolene tends to distinguish a lot of different strains from one another. And that tends to be one of those distinguishing factors that most people associate with sativa, but does not necessarily mean sativa. But you'll notice sativa is listed here on Jack Herer because Jack Herer is considered a sativa. Okay, so this is like, you know, a little bit of interesting information. This is telling us there's quite a bit of chemical similarity to most of these. Let's X out a few of them. Let's get rid of the two Nevada ones. And let's get rid of the Montana one, just because it has the least amount of information present. Okay, now let's rotate the cluster to those 4 outliers that are way out there.
How do I?
Yeah, it can get a little bit difficult whenever they're very far away. So let's click on that one, and there's a yellow one out there as well. The yellow one, I believe, is actually the furthest from the composite. There it is. Oh. Zoom out just a little bit more, and it'll be a little easier for you to get to it. Just zoom out a touch. There you go. There you go.
Okay.
For
Wow, look
everyone
at
else's
that. That's
reference,
so
whenever
different.
you're zoomed into an individual dot, like that's where everything's going to rotate around. So if
Okay.
something's really far away, just zoom out. It makes it a little easier.
Good to
All right.
know.
So now what we're looking at is the same strain genetics. And in fact, if you notice, most of those hanging out in the terpinolene arm were all Nevada strains. But then
Mhm.
there's this other Nevada strain that shows up super high for THCV and has almost no terpinolene in it.
It's amazing.
So that's totally bizarre.
Yeah.
It does register on the CBG spectrum a touch, but it also registers on the CBDV spectrum, which I haven't
Yeah.
seen yet, a little tiny bit. You can just see that little dark purple hanging
Mhm.
out at the bottom of that THCV curve. THC is sort of like right in the middle, which isn't completely unique, although the lower amount of THC to the higher amount of THCV is pretty unique. So that's in and of itself its own interesting profile. And its dominant terpene is beta-caryophyllene, not terpinolene. When you look in the middle of these imprints, you'll see a little circle. The circle shows you the dominant terpene or the dominant terpenes if there are additional terpenes that are present in high enough proportion that exist in this strain. And so when you look at the composite dot, you see mostly yellow in the middle. When you look at this dot, you see this kind of like olive green. That
Yeah.
olive green is the color of beta-caryophyllene,
Oh.
and it's dominating here. When you go over one to Oregon, you see no terpinolene. Beta-caryophyllene is the dominant terpene again. No THCV, but yet this like crazy large amount of CBN. Not crazy large. It's like, you know, like medium high amount of CBN. What does that tell us, right? Well, it could tell us that this particular Oregon producer had a very long cure, and
Mhm.
that cure over time degraded the THC to CBN, because we know that that's a thing that happens. It could be that they just had a really old batch. I don't know. But something that they're doing in their process is changing the chemical expression of the plant. And that is ultimately the point here. When you
That's
compare it to
amazing.
this other Oregon producer, you see very high amounts of CBG and terpinolene, which is sort of what we expect out of a Jack Herrera based on its composite. So this is a very good expression of how you can have the same strain, but it produce wildly different results, sometimes even in the exact same regions, right?
Amazing. Yeah.
And so you kind of have to
So
like
different.
feel your way through it, right? This isn't going to be perfect. This isn't going to show you, oh, I want Jack Herrera because it has the chemical profile I want. I live in Nevada. I'm going to go buy some Jack Herrera. Most likely is going to hit what you're looking for because most of it's hanging around each other. But if you end up with this crazy THCV dominant one, you might get a totally different reaction out of it that you weren't expecting, particularly if you respond well to terpinolene and not beta-caryophyllene, right?
Mhm.
So it's good to kind of continue to experiment, but you're making your educated guesses using this tool.
It's really cool. That's really
Yeah,
awesome.
let's do a different use case now.
Yes.
Let's keep the composite clicked on for Jack Herrera, and let's take off all the others. Okay, so let's say you've had Jack Herrera and you've had it in you know, a number of regions, and for the most part the composite does accurately tell you what you're looking for. Let's zoom back into that composite. So you just got to zoom in on that cluster. You don't have to double click it. It's already zoomed in there. So we're going to zoom in there. All right, now let's remove Jack Herrera from the search field in the top left. Yeah, just zero that out.
Ooh.
That's going to bring all the other dots back up. So
Wow.
now, if you want, go ahead and hit collapse on the drawer so we get just a little bit more screen space. Now you can rotate around the Jack Herrera dot and click on the other dots that are super close to that dot. Anything that's close to that dot is chemically very similar. Durban poison, that's
Wow.
actually kind of expected. Durban poison and Jack Herrera are often talked about as being great substitutes for one another. Click on that other dot nearby. We got Island Sweet Skunk, that's cool. What else we got? Ghost Train Haze, that's cool.
Interesting.
ATF. All right, now we want to expand the drawer so that we can look at these and hit close. I think it'll switch to expand. That's kind of I think a bug there. Hit expand now.
Okay.
Fix that. All right. So when you look at all 5 of these strains in comparison to one another, we're looking at almost identical chemical profiles. There's varying amounts of concentration that seem to happen from one harvest to the next. And a lot of these are composite dots, which mean we probably need to zero in a little bit further on individual producers and find out something that matches a little bit closer. But for the most part, these composite dots are all really great substitutes for one another. If Jack Herrera makes me feel focused and helps me deal with, remaining perked up creative, whatever the outcome might be. Most people use Jack Herer for those reasons. Then I can probably expect that Ghost Train Haze will also make me feel that way, or ATF, or Durban Poison, possibly Sweet Island Sweet Skunk. Although Island Sweet Skunk does have a lot more myrcene in it than these other strains do, so it could be that that one might be a little bit off-putting. But for the most part, these first three are really wonderful substitutes for one another.
Amazing.
So if I go into a store and I don't have the option to purchase Jack Herer, but they do have Ghost Train Haze or ATF, then I can make a pretty informed decision that those are going to make me feel good. And I might not buy ATF whatsoever because the name does not indicate anything for me.
Mm-hmm.
Some people know that hazes tend to produce terpinolene, but not many people know that ATF is also a great substitute for Jack Herer, right? So like this is one way for you to find the things that are ultimately going to make you feel similar to the things that other things make you feel like.
And this is amazing without trying them all, because I would never have known how without trying it. And I would go off of the, parents and try to see maybe if it gets something with the parents of this strain,
right.
And it doesn't usually work out like that.
Yeah. And, the other thing to keep in mind is that it's not perfect because the regulations do not require genetic certifications. So whenever we have, let's say 20 instances of Jack Herer in our data set, that is because those 20 instances were produced within the seed to sale tracking systems that exist in regulated markets as Jack Herer. But, did that producer certify those genetics going into it? Possibly not. So we're making the best educated guesses we can here. Some of these genetics are really tight, some aren't. Blue Dream, Gorilla Glue, Girl Scout cookies. For the most part, these are genetics that have been so overbred, and also they just happen to have really jingoey marketable names that a lot of people will produce something and just call it something like Blue Dream because they know that's going to get them, more sales. So you have to be sort of, and you've got to be suspect of that. And we're going to be forming partnerships in the future with, sources of data that can help us genetically verify strains here. But for the time being, this is the most information you're going to have in the store anyway. So, you know what I mean? This is going to give you a better sense of what to buy. Giving you another sense of this, like since we're on the point of genetics, let's go ahead and X out all these cards. There is a strain called Slimer, S-L-Y-M-E-R.
It's very appropriate for our Halloween conversation, Brad.
Isn't it? S-L-Y-M-E-R.
Oh, sorry.
We had to change it because Slimer is a Ghostbusters IP, right? Okay, so Slimer is one of those strain genetics that is almost only verified genetics, right? Slimer was produced specifically, intentionally, and certified. So we do know with Slimer at a very large amount of confidence that it is a tight genetic, that what we're seeing here are instances of the exact same strain genetic. And if you rotate through the cluster, the thing that really ultimately proves that point is how densely clustered they are compared to everything else. We'll also notice they're hanging out over here in this terpinolene arm, which I'll talk about here in a second. But for the most part, Slimer is Slimer. And yet, we still have this one way out here to the right that is different from all of the others hanging out together in the terpinolene arm. This is yet another version of the exact same Jack Herer experiment we just did with genetics that we know are definitely going to be tight. There's not going to be something called Slimer that isn't Slimer most likely here. So this line showing you that there's this variant chemically of Slimer that's totally different from the rest is legitimately because phenotype and growing condition and climate and cure and all of those choices absolutely change the chemical output of any given cannabis strain.
Amazing.
And it just depends on which of those decisions and in which variations of them you're using will determine a very different thing. It could be that most of these others that are sort of closer together, it could be that those growers are using relatively similar processes, similar fertilizers, similar lighting. You know what I mean? For the most part, a large chunk of the market is going to follow the leading trends on cultivation practices and best practices. So that's not super uncommon to see a strain produce similar chemical outputs just based on the fact that that's how the market's operating.
Wow.
But again, things can be different. So if you click on that Slimer composite, and then let's get rid of Slimer in the search bar and zoom in on Slimer that we clicked on. Oh, sorry, you got to double click on it.
Wait, come back. Okay.
All right, so you accidentally already clicked on alchemy, but let's click on a couple others that are nearby. Yeah, no worries.
Look at that, huh? That's interesting.
Green Kush, yeah, that's a version of green crack, by the way. That's what most people know as green crack. Hit this little flashing one over here to the left, by the way. You see the one that's going dark to light? Dutch treat, click on that. Okay, cool. Now click expand. So again, we're seeing a lot of the same colors in a lot of the same places. I don't necessarily need everybody to understand the data science here to be able to get a sense of similarity, right? If you look at the Slimer and we look at the Sage, with the, you know, a little bit of variance and potency of some of these analytes, almost all of them are relatively equal in proportion to one another based on their given composition. If you look at that alchemy on the far right, also relatively close, although it's missing that THCV, and it's missing the higher amounts of limonene. The Dutch treat is the furthest from the middle, right? So that one is the one that's flashing a little bit off to the left. It still has relatively similar proportions of things in it that the others do, except for the CBDV and CBN, which it only really shares with the Green Kush and the Alchemy to the right on the CBN side. So there's a couple things that are happening here that are different. But again, we're still looking at relatively similar strain compositions chemically, particularly between the Slimer, the Sage, and the Alchemy. The reason I wanted you to click on that Dutch treat that was flashing, this has nothing to do with patients and nothing to do with consumers, but there is a reason why these things are flashing, and that is that we're helping cannabis operators buy products on our wholesale marketplace that will match chemical expectations of strains that they already currently carry on their shelves. And so for consumers, one of the things that we want to do is not just educate ourselves on what's going to make us feel good, but also educate the retail stores we go into on exactly what we're looking for, and possibly even suggesting replacements that they can have on their shelves that are what we're looking for when they're out of that thing. For instance, again, if we love Slimer, for instance, it makes us feel great, but I go into my favorite retail store and they don't have Slimer, I want to be able to tell them, well, you should carry Dutch Treat or Sage or Alchemy if you don't carry Slimer, because those are relatively the same, and I'm looking for this specific combination of chemicals. In fact, I think for, you know, a lot of retailers, you're going to have at least a basis of education behind that store shelf that's large enough that you could probably bring this, your mobile phone in, show them this composite and say, this is the chemical profile I'm looking for. Do you know what you have on your shelves that matches this? If they live in Nevada, that's a no-brainer because the labels should tell you, right? But
nowhere else.
yeah, but in some markets, you do have educated bud tenders. Oregon, for instance, has probably the highest amount of retail stores that know chemical composition of their strains over any of the other markets I've been in. Some stores in Colorado, very few in California will have this information. But again, this is a way for us to push the market towards where we need it to be.
That's amazing. So it's flashing because they can, is that what this show and wholesale gallery is? Is that why?
Correct. It means that this strain right now is currently available for them to order on our wholesale gallery. And if they're an operator in Oregon, because right now it's only available in Oregon, we're about to make our wholesale marketplace available in multiple states, including all states nationwide eventually. So once they have access to all states, any single strain that exists on our wholesale marketplace will have this strobing effect where cannabis operators are able to hit show in wholesale gallery and put in an order right away. And the reason we want them to do this is because we want them to know that, like, you know, like for instance, I was talking with a retailer where Skittles is one of their most popular strains. A lot of people come in and buy Skittles probably for a lot of reasons, possibly the name alone, right? Because it denotes this idea that it's going to smell and taste wonderful and like candy, and who doesn't want that, right? But at the same time, it's happening that way because of its full chemical bouquet, right? The terpenes are determining
a lot of terps,
flavor, right? And the name is pretty nice, but what happens if they're out of Skittles, right? They could have a run on the store. A particular patient or customer might buy, multiple ounces of it, and they run out of their supply, or their producer is not doing their harvest regularly. Something happened, they lost their crop, whatever. A lot of things can happen that make them no longer able to offer Skittles. And you go in and you're like, ooh, you don't have Skittles, dang. What are you going to offer that person, right? Like, I'm disappointed when I go into a retail store and they don't have my favorite strain available. And in fact, I really hate it when they barely have my favorite strain available. It only shows up once every couple months.
Yes.
When I
we have that issue here in Jersey.
Oh yeah, totally.
Constantly.
Yeah. But even in Colorado, when I was there in 2016 and 2017, that one of my favorite growers and cultivators and retailers, they were vertically integrated, would carry Colombian Gold. Colombian Gold is one of the most perfect strains for me. I loved it, taste and flavor. It was amazing. I love land races, and it made both me and my wife feel the same, which is super rare.
Awesome, yeah.
But they would only have Colombian Gold 2 times a year, 3 times a year, maybe. And once they had Colombian Gold, it sold out like gangbusters. Everybody wanted it. So there were 3 or 4 strains that this particular retailer carried that were similar to this, and that if it ever got on the shelf or got on the menu, if you didn't go buy a whole lot of it, you were SOL, and you probably weren't going to get your hands on it. But if that retailer could have told me, yeah, sorry, we're out of the Colombian Gold. I know that that's one of your favorites. However, I don't know if you've noticed, but this other strain is chemically almost identical to that Colombian Gold. So you should get the same effect, if not even the same flavor and smell from it that you got from the Colombian Gold. That's the best we could do. That's way better than, yeah, sorry, you just have to get in whenever it's available.
It's huge. And for patients, it's massive, because a lot of times patients will find 1 or 2 strains that treats their condition, or that, treats their symptoms. And then when you can't get it, it sucks. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to a certain extent, you're kind of at the whims of what's popular in the market. So if you're like me, I have a chemical reaction, in my brain to strains that are different than most of the market. If I have any of these strains that we're looking at right now, I'm going to geek out. I'm going to have a major panic attack. And
I'm very anxious from it.
Yeah. But the other thing that happens to me is I get typically stoned stupid. Whenever I smoke what most people consider a high sativa or a high terpinolene strain, what that will do to me is make me sort of kind of dopey, kind of couch locked. I tend to laugh at things that are way lower brow humor. Whenever I smoke something that typically makes people couch locked and all of those things, it actually makes me focused and productive and happy, and I want to do things physically.
The same for me. The things that would traditionally put people to sleep is what makes me work better.
Right. Absolutely. So who's to account for us? We're sort of the exception, not the rule. 90% of people who will smoke something high in terpinolene are probably going to feel uppy and creative and peppy. And you and I are going to feel really, debilitated. So if that's what's super popular on the market, and it is, and that's what most people are producing, and it is, then it's really hard for people who need sort of like Ritalin for an ADD person, need a specific treatment out of the cannabis we smoke that just happens to be different from most of the market, but it's how our brains work. So this is why we're not showing you in Connect what you should expect from a given strain. We're not saying Dutch Treat's going to make you feel really peppy, because we don't know. What Dutch Treat will make you feel like, it's what it's going to make you feel like. And then based on how that makes you feel, good or bad, peppy or sedated, anxiety relief or pain relief, whatever that condition, you'll be able to look at this chemical profile and say, okay, that's the chemical profile that produces X, Y, and Z. So other strains with that chemical profile will produce X, Y, and Z in me, not in everybody.
What's amazing also with this could be remarkable for caregivers, who don't have that ability to, they can see what helps their loved ones, and they can choose strains that they know are going to be, similar to those, because it's a big issue. It's a lot of guesswork. And if you're a caregiver, especially if you're treating children, it could be really, really scary giving them new things. So this is
absolutely
so amazing. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, really, we're quickly moving towards a world where health recommendations are going to be made based on what chemical profile you should look for in a given cannabis product.
It should be. This should be.
strain, concentrates, whatever, right?
Mhm.
There are new technologies being developed. There are new processes being developed where eventually you're going to get a full genetic profile and brain chemistry profile, and you'll know exactly what you need to look for. And the way to be able to find what's going to fit those recommendations is knowing the chemical profile of these plants, right? So that's ultimately what we're trying to present here. It's not perfect. It's not complete. It's not where we all want it to eventually be. Right now, it's the best thing we have and the most informative thing we have, I think, to letting us know what exists out there in the market. What is the chemical profile of what exists out there in the market? How can we make more informed decisions as consumers? Because when we go into a store, still to this day, 95% of all cannabis is bought and sold based on indica sativa hybrid. And yet, almost the entire cannabis industry knows that's nonsense, and they continue to perpetuate this in front of the consumers and their patients. And so the consumers and patients don't know what to think. They don't know what to believe. They're told constantly indica sativa hybrid matter. And so they think that's what determines effect, but it really, really, really doesn't. In fact, we don't see a whole lot of justification in the chemical data that shows that there's any difference between indica sativa hybrid.
It's amazing.
So let's X out these 5 cards. I want to show you one last thing here real quick, which I've been sort of alluding to, which is ultimately the shape of the cluster itself. I keep mentioning that terpinolene arm, but I want to talk a little bit about how to understand the cluster entirely by its shape and to know what you're looking at when you're looking at certain parts of it. So the distribution of these dots is based on similarity and differences alone. There is no true like center point to the cluster. There is no like baseline median genetic strain that is representative of the average of all strains. There's too much data and there's too much variance for that math to make sense. So ultimately, the cluster distributes itself based on the current data set that we have, and it adjusts based on new data that we get constantly. And it determines its own shape based on that algorithm of math, right? That we're doing math in 26 dimensions essentially, and it's determining the shape every single day based on that, which means it changes generally every day. We don't know by how much.
Amazing.
But no matter how much we play with the math, or no matter how many different iterations of the cluster exist, the one thing that always happens is this little section that bursts out of the main cluster and has a densely clustered head, but it's sort of like a full collection of dots that is extended away from the main cluster of dots. So what you're seeing in the cluster is the market itself, right? Most of the market is this like main chunk here in the middle, but then there's a large section of the market that's sort of pulled off on the side here. So very rarely will one particular chemical determine a massive difference in the data set. The few that do are CBD. Obviously, you can see CBD forms its own little region. That always happens. And that's because specifically CBD dominant strains are grown to be CBD dominant. And the balanced strains are so vastly different from THC dominant strains that they still live in their own little space. Yeah. Although we're starting to see a couple of those dots leaving the region and moving it themselves a little bit towards the cluster. That's happening more and more, and it's kind of cool to watch it happen. So the first iteration of that, you saw just white space in between the two. So like I said, it changes. But the other chemical that determines a massive difference in the cluster is terpinolene. So this arm is the terpinolene arm. There's a pretty popular expectation that hazes in general genetically produce terpinolene on average. So if you did a search for just the word haze in the search bar, you'll notice that all of the strains that have the word haze in them seem like, for the most part, the majority of them densely cluster in this little section here. While there are still, like I mentioned before, variants chemically of any given strain, you're going to see, quite a few hazes not follow the terpinolene law. But law of averages here, at least 2/3 of those dots are clustered together in the terpinolene arm. So it is not incorrect to state that a haze should produce terpinolene. A haze should, but it might not. You know what I mean? So probably will, might not, and you need to know that going in. But that's sort of one of the things about the shape of the cluster itself. You can delete haze now.
It's so neat. I can't wait to see what it turns into eventually. Imagine how it's going to grow. It's going to be
right. Yeah. Someone even suggested that I set up a screen capture recording within the database for 3 or 4 days and then compress it so that we can see.
Do it over like a few months.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it all depends on how much it changes, right? So yeah, the other thing I want to show you here, click on the left, there's a little tab that says imprint on the far left. There you go. So when you click that imprint tab, it's going to highlight what we call regions, right? So when you rotate the cluster around, you'll see these iridescent bubbles that sort of encapsulate different sections of the cluster. Those regions all show specific chemical similarities that are so similar that they get their own region kind of highlighted and encapsulated. So obviously our CBD region is highlighted and encapsulated. The entire terpinolene arm in and of itself has you know, this one major region, but even within the terpinolene arm are densely clustered specific parts of that region that are different. So you know, you can see where at the very end of that head there's like a whole, like a very high concentration of terpenolenes. Anytime that you hover over a region, it'll show you the imprint of that region on the left. Wow. So that's what's populating over there, not the dots, but the actual region itself. One of my favorite regions actually has nothing to do with this arm. In fact, you'll like my region. It's generally high in CBG, high in myrcene. Here's one. If you go down, well, you're kind of zoomed in on that Slimer genetic, I think, still. But yeah, that region over to the left, the one below it, go down one. This one here.
I'm sorry, Brad. My dog is going crazy.
Yeah, no worries. This is the region I particularly enjoy, although it's not my favorite. I like ones with higher amounts of myrcene in it, but the combination of limonene, myrcene, beta-caryophyllene, and CBG with a sort of even amount of linalool in the pinene, that is what I'm looking for chemically. Generally, I like it to be a little higher in the myrcene limonene share, but yeah, this is where you and I are going to be able to find our medication, right? Is in a region like this, not necessarily that other region where, you know, Jack Herrera and Durban Poison live.
Right.
So there are some strains here, and especially in the region that here. Actually, I'm going to show you a different thing real quick on how you can navigate regions. Click off that card, Grandpa's Breath. Looks like got accidentally clicked on. All right, in the far left-hand corner, in the very bottom, there's a little map icon. You see that? Yeah. All right, let's click that. This is going to show you all of the regions that exist by their imprint within the cluster. So it gives an overlay so that you can see sort of what to expect from the given strains of that region. The region that I love the most, let me see if I can, hold on a second. I think your overlay is over actually. Okay, to the left one. Go to the left one. This one here, click on that.
Yeah, those exciting.
Bam. All right, so in this region, you should find things like, you know, strains that you've probably had that you like. You should find a little bit more fruity strains or sweet strains. Wedding Cake is a great one. Obama Kush, I believe, hangs out here. Blackberry Kush should be somewhere. Purple Kush, right? So these are going to be your typically more fruity dominant flavored strains, but they're also going to have a lot more of that spiciness that you see typically associated with what do you call them? Indicas. Some of these have THCV. I'm not super into THCV, but you know, that's for you to figure out, right? There's another region that is pretty similar to this one that doesn't have any THCV in it as well. That's where you'll find the mangoes, the pineapples, the banana, honey banana, blackberry kush, blueberry cookies. Great region for me, right? So regions are another way that you can sort of navigate the, oh yeah, let's look in that region right there. Regions are a way that you can navigate the cluster itself and find what area of the cluster you ultimately should focus on. You know, which of these are going to have a higher concentration of the things you're looking for than the others. And again, like I said, Skittles and Obama Kush, great substitutes for one another, by the way. And so it so happened in that use case I was telling you earlier of the retailer that has Skittles as a very popular strain, they also happen to have Obama Kush on their shelves. So those two pair really, really well together as you know, options for someone who likes Skittles but doesn't see it on the shelf. Rude Boy is another one. But either way, the point is you can find the region that you like, you can find the regions you don't like, and you'll know really what to stay away from. You're going to find some genetics that exist in both regions, the ones you like and the ones you don't like. For instance, Gorilla Glue or Kim Dog are not typically strains that I like. I don't like strains that have a gluey, chemical, fuely, diesel profile to them. They don't make me feel great. They usually make me feel real racy. But yet, you know, there's a Gorilla Glue hanging out in this region. So what that tells me is there's some Gorilla Glue I actually could enjoy. There's some Kim Dog I could enjoy. So long as it's coming from the right state and the right producer, I can find those that actually make me feel good. But I'm probably going to avoid them for other options that I know I can find, like Wedding Cake or Obama Kush or Rude Boy or 9 Pound Hammer, that all have names that don't sound fruity. They don't sound like a name substitute for what I look for, right? But they actually are a chemical substitute of what I look for. And ultimately, that's what matters.
That's amazing. So helpful. I mean, this could really be really transformational for patients.
Yep. And if you don't do a lot of traveling as a patient or consumer, you can click on the tools pane on the far left and just look at what's available in your state. Cool. That way you're really whittling this thing down to your specific region. Right now we're showing the whole nation. Unfortunately, New Jersey's not here yet, but it will be. It will be soon. Right? It will be. But if you want to see, like, you know, just what's available in Nevada, then you can just click that. And like I said, we've got a lot of Nevada data because it's required. But if that's where you live, if you're coming to Nevada for MJ Biz,
I am.
You start to use this to explore what you should go find while you're there.
I will be today. Who needs an agenda? Just gonna,
right? Exactly.
I need to know what strains I'm picking up.
Yeah. So we're going to be developing this further in the future. Like I said, we want to be able to add certifications for, you know, certified genetics. We would also love to be able to connect with sources of data that are experiential. Right now, we're only showing quantified data. We would like to show qualified data. So I would like to know, you know, from really good, solid sets of data, do most people feel, like I mentioned earlier, peppy and creative and focused on high terpinolene strains? And what is the percentage amount of people who don't? You know, is it really 90-10? Is it really more like 60-40? Do we really know this information? I don't think we do.
Oh, I would love to. I don't think anybody knows that information. That would be amazing if you guys were able to, like, accrue that. Wow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we're doing our best to try to find who has that data that we can connect to. To a certain extent, I'm mentioning it right now because if there's anyone listening who has access to a set of data that is really solid, that is done through, you know, solid science, like, we want to connect to that data and partner and showcase that, you know, as a unified amount of information, right? But because right now, what little information we do have, unfortunately, doesn't record things like brain chemistry or diet or sleep and work regimen, or any of the things that happen in our bodies that change the way cannabis makes us feel. Our endocannabinoid system affects something like 30+% of our entire body's systems functions, especially our brain's functions. So if it's that potent of a system on our bodies, and we're not understanding what the rest of our systems look like, how can we really say that a given cannabinoid terpene thing entered into a 30% effective system on our whole body is going to make us feel anything if we don't know what the rest of our body is doing? Right now, I'm using a bunch of, like, loose numbers here because none of this has actually been determined, but you get my point, which is that the information that exists is just incomplete, that we know of, and we really need a more complete research data set to be able to showcase qualified data, but we want to, and it will be there eventually.
It's amazing. I can't wait to see it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So for people who are, like, really wanting to understand what they're looking at here, who didn't get enough information from how I explained it, there are these little question marks that show up in every single one of these tool panes. On the imprint question mark, for instance, if you click that one there that you just hovered on, click that. This will actually show you how to read the imprint. It shows you the data science that goes into it. It shows you how to understand potency and expected distributions. So if you really want to understand all of the ways that the imprint works, you can go through this information there. Information on the cards is available. So these little question marks exist everywhere. It's good info. It definitely will give those who are curious and want to deep dive in further the ability to understand how to read the imprint better. But, you know, honestly, for most people, even for myself, who is super educated on how the imprint works, all I had to do was just look at, you know, sort of the distribution of colors and see where the colors were and what looks the same like that, right? I was able to use it in a very, you know, simplified, you know, diminutive way to still get really good results.
Mhm.
Blackberry Kush usually works good for me. I found 2 strains I normally wouldn't buy because I didn't expect them to produce what Blackberry Kush produces in effect, and that was Mango Kush and Pineapple Fields, both
Oh,
which sound like tropical strains that are
yeah,
very
they sound
different from,
really
yeah, it just doesn't sound like what you would think is the same. But in Oregon, I found a Mango Kush and a Pineapple Fields that were amazing strains that made me feel exactly like I thought they should make me feel. And the reason I thought that was because I used this tool just by looking at colors, right?
amazing.
So you can use this very effectively without needing to know the data science. But if you want to know it, there's a way to find out.
So cool. So, so, so cool.
Yeah.
Anything
Yeah, we're
else?
excited about it. And, you know, I'm hoping that this becomes a really useful tool for people to start making better understanding of how cannabis makes them feel.
I
And
think it's a,
particularly,
I
oh,
think,
go ahead.
sorry to cut you off. I think it's a
Yeah.
remarkable tool for healthcare providers. Exactly. Like,
Yeah,
to help guide patients. I mean, it can be really, really, really significant for them.
indeed. Indeed. Yeah, I totally agree. And, and I just think I really hope this has a major effect in helping push us out of using information that doesn't matter anymore, that doesn't
Yeah.
mean anything anymore, to make
Hybrid
the
and
majority
sativa
of,
and indica.
yeah, I mean, isn't it nuts that 95%, maybe, I don't know what the actual number is, but like as much as that is being sold and bought based on information that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. Like, could you imagine going to buy a car and the information they told you about the car was like only about the hue of the paint and, the source of the fabric, but they're not telling you anything about its gas mileage or, the way the engine runs, whether it's electric or combustion, like the things that you actually need to know, right? Like, can you
That's
imagine?
a great analogy. I mean, yeah,
Right.
you're
If
absolutely
almost
right.
every car was bought that way, where everyone's like, "Oh yeah, I got this car because I really like this color red." Like
Yeah.
that's not how cars are bought and sold. That's not how cannabis is going to be bought
Yeah.
and sold in the future.
I love it. I love it so much. So thank
Yeah.
you so much, Brad. I really, really appreciate it. So everybody can just go to confidentcannabis.com and click, you said there's a link at the top for connect
Yep.
or
Yep.
confidentcannabis.
Correct. Either works as long as you get there.
Awesome. Very, very cool. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank
And
you for
thank
taking
you
the
for
time.
watching.